In the group chat at dawn, my son typed, "Don't wake the baby with calls." I sent one message anyway, and that's when I knew I had become an inconvenience in my own family. The words had not been meant as cruel. I know that. They were practical, a reminder typed quickly in the haze of early morning while his wife nursed the child. But the way my name wasn't mentioned, the way the instruction landed like a rule issued in a household where I was suddenly a guest and no longer the mother who once decided everything, that hurt in a place so deep it felt like silence itself. I stared at my phone for a long time, the blue glow of the screen brushing across the kitchen tiles where I sat with my tea. The steam curled and vanished, yet I didn't move to sip. His words had stiffened something in me, made me sit straighter as if I were waiting for permission to exhale. For decades, I was the one who held night vigils, shushing colic cries, soothing fevers with damp cloths, singing lullabies while pacing rooms until the dawn cracked. And now, in the span of one curt sentence, I was reminded that the sound of my voice, once salvation, might now be disturbance. Still, I tapped out a message. It was small, timid really. Just, "I'll be careful. How is she this morning?" I pressed send. The bubble floated up in the chat, pale against the gray background, waiting for acknowledgement. It felt like tossing a pebble into a wide, indifferent sea. No reply came for several minutes. Instead, the 3 dots flickered, then disappeared. The baby's needs, I told myself. They were busy. But in that pause, in that suspended uncertainty, I began to see a new geography forming between us. Not one of miles, I live only 2 bus rides away, but of relevance. A mother once stands at the center of her child's orbit, then slowly, without ceremony, she drifts outward, becomes a moon instead of a sun. I touched the edge of my mug, the tea long cooled. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking each second in a house that had grown too quiet. I used to resent noise, the banging of doors, the stomp of feet, the television too loud. Now, I craved the smallest sign of life. A message finally appeared, "She's fine. We'll let you know if we need anything." I read it over and over. There was gratitude buried there, I suppose, though it was thin, like a thread pulled taut. I felt the absence of warmth more than the presence of words. The "we" stood out too, not "I'll let you know, Mom, but we'll let you know." I was being spoken to from within a unit where I was no longer included. The young family had formed their circle, and I was on the rim. I tried to busy myself, wiping down counters that were already clean, watering plants that didn't thirst. The rituals of a day alone stretch like elastic, you fill them with small tasks, meaningless almost, to keep from dwelling. But inside me, the sting of that morning exchange pulsed. When my son was born, I remember my mother, his grandmother, trying to advise me. I snapped at her once, in the thick fog of sleepless nights. "Let me figure it out," I had said, sharper than I meant. She had stepped back, quiet. I saw her pain only years later, reflected in the eyes of my daughter-in-law when she closed the nursery door gently in my face during my first visit after they brought the baby home. She smiled politely, but her hand lingered on the knob, a barrier disguised as kindness. That morning's message was not an isolated thing. It was the latest stitch in a seam that had been pulling tighter. Visits arranged rather than spontaneous, advice welcomed only when asked, photographs shared in the group chat instead of handed across a table. Slowly, I had become a spectator to the very life I once built. I thought about calling anyway. The urge rose fierce in me, almost rebellious. To hear the babies gurgle, to remind them that I was not just a voice to silence. But I put the phone back on the counter. My hands shook slightly, not from age, but from restraint. Instead, I pulled open the drawer by the sink, the one where I kept little tokens. There was the pair of knitted booties I had made in anticipation, soft blue yarn that never fit the baby because she was born bigger than expected. There was the photograph of my son holding her for the first time, his face so open with awe that I cried when I first saw it. I touched the edge of the frame, tracing the shape of his young jawline, a line I knew well from childhood, from the days when he leaned into my shoulder, sweaty from play, smelling of sun and dirt. Now, that same jaw tightened when I lingered too long at their house. "Mom, we've got it under control," he'd say, not unkindly, but firmly enough that I knew when to gather my things and leave. I had not realized, until that dawn, that motherhood doesn't end. It only changes its costume, from central actor to supporting role, then perhaps to background scenery. I wasn't ready to be scenery. So I sent the message. Small, almost invisible in its courage. But it was mine. A way of saying, I am still here. The rest of the day carried on, but my mind didn't let go. Every sound in the house, the whir of the refrigerator, the faint hum of traffic outside, seemed to mock the quiet of my phone. Hours passed with no follow-up. I imagined them busy, I imagined the baby asleep, I imagined everything except the simplest truth, perhaps they did not think of me. That evening, I walked to the small shop at the corner, needing the air. The street smelled faintly of rain, though the clouds had only threatened all day. Inside, I bought bread, though I still had half a loaf at home. The young clerk smiled absently, his attention more on his phone than on me. I envied him, that easy absorption in a world where his mother probably still called without being told not to. Back home, I cut 2 slices, buttered them slowly, and left the rest untouched. The loneliness pressed close, not dramatic, but steady, like a weight you carry in your pocket that no one else can see. I told myself not to take it personally. Children grow, they cleave away, they make new families. It is the way of life. Yet the ache of being on the outside does not lessen simply because it is common. Pain does not dilute with knowledge, it remains sharp in the body it inhabits. That night, I placed my phone on the bedside table, screen down. A small act of defiance. If they needed me, they would call. If not, I would not stare at the glowing silence anymore. But even as I closed my eyes, sleep-thin and fitful, my ears strained for the smallest vibration. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, though I had nothing pressing to do. My eyes opened to the dim light spreading across the curtains, the familiar hush of my small street outside. I lay still, listening. Years ago, mornings were not mine. They belonged to hurried breakfasts, mismatched socks, the scrape of chairs, my son shouting that he couldn't find his school bag. There was always noise. I had craved a little silence then. Funny how cruel memory is, it reminds you that what once felt burdensome can become the very thing you miss when it's gone. I rose and put the kettle on, the soft pop of boiling filling the quiet. I tried not to check my phone. But eventually, I did. A single message from the group chat had come overnight, sent by my daughter-in-law. Rough night, she didn't sleep much. We're exhausted. Please don't come over today, we just need rest. There was a smiley face at the end, as if that softened the dismissal. But I saw through it. My help was not wanted. My presence was not comfort. I was interference. The words sliced through me in a way I didn't want to admit. I typed a reply, then deleted it. What could I say? That I had paced my own floors years ago, bleary-eyed, surviving nights when my son would not settle? That I had longed for someone, anyone, to come hold him for half an hour so I could close my eyes? But times are different, I reminded myself. People are different. She had her mother, after all, nearby. It was her arms they called for, not mine. I set my phone down and stirred honey into my tea. The sweetness barely registered. I had the distinct sense of being on a shelf, like an ornament admired from afar but never touched. It wasn't malice, I didn't believe they hated me. It was simply that they did not see me. Not really. Later that day, I ventured into town. The bus ride was slow, stopping every few streets, filled with chatter of schoolchildren and tired workers. I sat by the window, watching the rows of houses blur into shops, shops into offices. I carried with me a small bag of knitted caps I had made for the baby, soft pastel shades I thought would be useful. I had planned to drop them off, but after the morning's message, I decided instead to stop by the church donation box. The caps went into the bin quietly, without announcement. It hurt to let them go, but keeping them in my cupboard would hurt more. I wandered into a cafe after one I hadn't visited in years. The tables were mostly filled with younger people, laptops open, coffee cups cooling beside them. I ordered tea and sat alone, feeling both invisible and oddly relieved by it. In that space, I wasn't defined as mother or grandmother. I was just another patron, anonymous. As I sipped, I watched a young couple nearby. They leaned close, whispering, laughing softly. Their hands brushed often, the kind of careless affection that is natural when you are certain of your place in someone's world. I remembered sitting like that once, opposite my husband, before life hardened us with bills and responsibilities, before his absence carved out half my world. Memory brought a heaviness, but also a peculiar comfort. I had lived those days. I had been seen once, completely, without question. The walk back to the bus stop was slow. My legs ached more these days, though I tried not to dwell on it. I stopped at a small florist on the corner and bought a single carnation, pale pink. Not for anyone in particular. Just to bring some color into the house. The shopkeeper wrapped it gently, as though aware of the fragility not just of the flower, but of the hand that held it. Back home, I placed it in a glass vase on the table. The room looked less empty for a moment. I sat, staring at it, then reached instinctively for my phone again. No new messages. The silence was louder than anything. By evening, I felt restless. I boiled potatoes, mashed them with butter, roasted a piece of chicken. I set the table for two out of habit, then removed the extra plate. The clink of ceramic against wood rang sharp. I ate slowly, tasting little. Every bite reminded me that meals are best when shared. Afterward, I took a walk through the neighborhood. The air was cool, dusk settling in violet shades. Windows glowed in other houses, each lit square revealing lives in motion, children running across living rooms, families gathering at tables, television screens flickering. I tried not to envy, but envy crept in anyway. I thought of knocking on my son's door, unannounced. Just appearing with a smile, offering my arms, ignoring the earlier message. But I knew how that would end. A forced politeness, the unspoken sigh of relief when I left. Better to preserve what dignity I had. When I returned home, the street lamps had come on. I stood at my gate a moment, staring at the familiar brick walls, the garden hedge trimmed neatly. It was a good house, steady and warm. But it was no longer filled with life. Homes, I realized, are not built from walls but from voices. Inside, I pulled out the old photo albums. I flipped through pages, faces smiling from years ago. My son at 5, missing his front teeth. My husband with his arm around us both, pride shining. Christmas mornings, birthdays, graduations. Proof that I had been necessary, once. Proof that I had mattered. I lingered long on one picture, my son at 14, awkward and tall, resting his head against my shoulder. He had been embarrassed by it afterward, but in the moment, he had leaned into me without hesitation. I touched the glossy page, the ghost of weight that would never return. That night, I dreamed of a hallway. Doors lined both sides, each one leading to a room where my son grew older, toddler, boy, teenager, man. I walked past them all, but the final door was closed. I knocked, and from inside came the sound of a baby crying. When I tried to open it, the handle would not turn. I woke with the echo of that locked door still in my chest. Morning again. The carnation on the table had opened wider overnight, petals fragile but determined. I admired it as I sipped my tea, then braced myself before checking my phone. A single message again, this time from my son, "We'll come by this weekend, just for a short visit. Don't fuss, we can't stay long." My heart lifted, then fell in the same breath. A short visit. No fuss. Instructions, boundaries, rules. Still, I would take it. I typed back, "I'll make tea." That's all. When Saturday came, I prepared carefully. Not fussing, as he had asked, but tidying nonetheless. I polished the table, laid out cups, bought fresh biscuits. The carnation, now wilting, I replaced with a new bloom. Yellow this time. Hopeful. They arrived late, harried, the baby fussing in her carrier. My son kissed my cheek quickly, already distracted. My daughter-in-law smiled, weary. I reached for the baby, but she hesitated, adjusting straps, fussing with blankets. Eventually, she placed the child in my arms. The warmth against my chest nearly undid me. I swayed gently, humming without thinking. The baby quieted, eyes heavy. For a moment, time folded in on itself, and I was back in my own small living room decades earlier, cradling the same weight, humming the same tune. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I blinked them away. "Don't let her sleep too long," my daughter-in-law said quickly. "We're trying to keep her on schedule." I nodded, though the urge to argue burned. I wanted to say, babies don't keep schedules, they keep mothers awake. I wanted to say, I know what I'm doing. But I bit my tongue. After tea, after small talk, after the baby's brief nap, they left. The house was silent again. I sat in the chair where I had rocked her, holding the faint warmth still clinging to my arms. I whispered into the emptiness, "I'm still here." That evening, I opened the group chat and typed a message. Just one. "Thank you for visiting." It meant a lot. No one replied for hours. When the answer finally came, it was a thumbs-up emoji from my son. Just that. A picture instead of words. A token instead of acknowledgement. I stared at it until my eyes blurred, then set the phone down. It was not malice. It was not neglect. It was simply life pulling forward, leaving me on the edges. Still, edges hold the fabric together. Without them, things unravel. I only wished they remembered that. I didn't mute the group chat, though I wanted to. Instead, I placed my phone face down on the kitchen table and made tea as if my hands could occupy the ache inside me. The house was silent except for the slow drip of the kettle. When I sat down, the yellow carnation leaned toward the light in a way that almost looked deliberate. It struck me, even a flower knows where to turn when it needs something. I had forgotten how to do that. Later that week, I noticed a flyer taped to the grocer's window. It was nothing extraordinary, just a call for volunteers at the library's baby rhyme time, asking for help with mats, toys, and tidying. I stood there with my bread and eggs and stared at the paper longer than I should have. The thought came unbidden, maybe if my hands weren't welcome in my son's house, they could be useful somewhere else. Before I could talk myself out of it, I copied the number and dialed when I got home. A cheerful woman answered, and when she said, "We'd love to have you," I felt my throat tighten. I had not realized how much I needed to be wanted. On Thursday, I put on a red scarf I rarely wore because it felt too bright. In the mirror, it startled me, but I decided not to take it off. The library smelled of old paper and dust, the way it always had, but the children's section was alive with color and noise. I helped lay down mats, watched parents shuffle in with weary eyes, and suddenly the room was filled with tiny wails and soft coos. A baby fussed in her pram, and the mother looked at me with the same exhaustion I remembered carrying decades ago. "Would you like me to hold her?" I asked gently. She hesitated, then nodded. The weight in my arms was like a memory returned, small, warm, fragile, and utterly trusting. I hummed without thinking, and she quieted. The mother's eyes softened, and for the first time in a long while, I felt myself expand beyond the narrow space of my empty house. When rhyme time ended, I folded blocks into boxes, collected stray socks, handed out wipes. One father struggled with a sling, his hands clumsy, his face red with frustration. I showed him how to thread the fabric, then stepped back, letting him finish. He smiled at me as though I'd given him more than instructions. When it was all done, the librarian touched my arm and said, "See you next week?" I nodded, and the word yes felt like breath-filling lungs I'd forgotten I had. Walking home, I chose the long route by the river. The geese made their ridiculous honking noises, and a boy threw bread they didn't want, laughing anyway. I sat on a bench and let the sun fall across my face. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the urge to check my phone. The quiet wasn't loneliness that afternoon. It was rest. That night, when I did finally look, there were photos in the chat, my granddaughter on a blanket, reaching her tiny fists into the air. I typed, "She's growing so fast," and pressed send. My daughter-in-law replied with a handful of stars. No long exchange, but I noticed something. It didn't sting the way it once had. Perhaps because I had spent my afternoon being useful to strangers. I wasn't only waiting anymore. Still, the ache returned in moments. Saturday evening, I saw my name in a thread I wasn't meant to be included in, a conversation between my son and his wife about visiting her mother. They worried I might be upset. They weren't unkind, just careful, as though I were fragile glass that might crack if left out. I closed the thread and made tea with shaking hands. Then, before bitterness could root, I sent a different message. "I'm going to the museum tomorrow. Have a good visit. Love you." It wasn't a plan until I wrote it, but the moment I pressed send, it became true. The museum was quiet, cool, filled with the dust of time. I stopped in front of a winter landscape, brushstrokes of white with green hiding underneath. I stared a long time, thinking how life is often like that, colors layered beneath what looks empty. A man near my age stood beside me, and without turning, he asked, "Do you see the green under the white?" "Yes," I said, and for a moment, we shared something wordless and human. When I left, I bought nothing in the gift shop, just an apple from a vendor outside. I bit into it walking home, the tartness sharp and real on my tongue. It reminded me that I was still here, still capable of small joys that belonged only to me. That night, a message appeared from my son. "Are you up? We could use a favor." My heart lurched, the old reflex to leap. I steadied myself and replied, "Yes, if I can." He called, not texted, but called, his voice tired. They had run out of formula, the baby was crying, the shops near them were closed. Could I help? I didn't hesitate. I pulled on my coat, found the brand in the late-night shop, and walked it to their door. My daughter-in-law opened, hair mussed, eyes grateful. I handed her the bag, whispered, "Sleep," and stepped back without crossing the threshold. In the morning, there was a message waiting, "Thank you. I'm sorry if we've been distant. We're still learning. Your help meant more than I said." It came from her, not him, and something in me softened. I wrote back, "We were all new once. I'm here, but I'll give you room." I placed the phone down and sat with the words. For the first time, I felt not like a shadow but like a shoreline, close enough to study, far enough to let them sail. The following week, I noticed how different my mornings felt. It wasn't that the silence had lifted, the house was still quiet, the kettle still the loudest thing in the room, but the silence no longer felt like a verdict. It was simply air. I had somewhere to go now, something to do that was not waiting for a message that might never come. Thursdays belonged to the library, and that knowledge steadied me. The second session was busier than the first. Twice as many parents, twice as much mess, and a sea of tiny limbs thrashing to their own rhythms. I moved among them, helping a mother peel off a baby-soaked onesie, offering tissues, stacking rattles. One boy cried so hard his face turned crimson, and I remembered that fierce helplessness, the way sound can pierce your skull until you feel you'll break. I lifted him when his father's arms faltered, and the baby's cries hiccuped into silence. The father looked at me with eyes that held both shame and relief. "You've got magic," he muttered. "No," I said, rocking gently. "Just practice." Those hours gave me something I hadn't expected, not just usefulness, but a sense of belonging to a rhythm larger than myself. I came home tired, yes, but the kind of tired that comes from being part of something rather than from carrying emptiness. The flower on my table, wilting now, seemed less lonely in its fading. That Saturday, my son sent a message in the late afternoon, "Are you around tomorrow? Could you come by for lunch?" I read it twice, startled by its softness. Not a request for help, not an instruction, just an invitation. I replied yes, though I kept my tone light, unwilling to let hope swell too quickly. When I arrived, the table was already set, plates mismatched but cheerful. My daughter-in-law greeted me at the door, the baby balanced on her hip. She looked tired, but not defensive, and I realized with a shock how young she still was. Younger than I had been when my son was born. We sat together, eating pasta that clung stubbornly to our forks, laughing when the baby shrieked for attention. Afterward, I carried my granddaughter into the living room while they cleared dishes. She reached for my necklace, chubby fingers closing around the chain, and for a moment, her weight against me was the only truth that mattered. My son walked in and saw us, and something softened in his face, not just gratitude, but recognition. Recognition that I was still part of this, still capable of love that was steady and quiet, not smothering. We spent the afternoon talking about nothing, weather, groceries, the latest absurdity in the news. But beneath it was something I hadn't felt in months, ease. They didn't hover, they didn't rush me out the door. When I finally rose to leave, my daughter-in-law pressed a container of leftovers into my hand. "So you don't have to cook tonight," she said, and the gesture nearly undid me. On the bus ride home, I held the container on my lap like a gift far greater than pasta. Not because of what it contained, but because it was offered without obligation. It was a bridge, however small. Yet change is never steady. The next week brought silence again, no messages, no calls. I found myself falling into old habits, glancing at the phone too often, wondering if I had imagined the thaw. The emptiness pressed hard one evening, so I walked to the corner cafe and ordered tea I didn't need. The young barista smiled without seeing me, and I sat by the window watching people hurry past. Couples with shopping bags, teenagers laughing too loudly, an old man dragging his dog along. Life everywhere, bustling around me, while I sat with nothing but a steaming cup for company. I nearly left when a woman about my age slid into the chair opposite mine. She wore a coat the color of moss and carried a bag full of books. "Do you mind?" she asked, already sitting. I shook my head. She smiled and said she came there every Tuesday after her book club, because her apartment felt too quiet afterward. We began to talk, about books, about the cafe's terrible chairs, about how rain in the city always smelled faintly of smoke. Her name was Helen, and before she left, she said, "Come to the club next week. We're reading something dreadful, but at least it makes for conversation." Walking home, I realized how long it had been since someone outside my family had invited me into anything. And how much I wanted to say yes. That Sunday, my son actually called, not texted, to ask if I could watch the baby for an hour while they ran errands. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was trust. When they returned, my daughter-in-law found me on the floor surrounded by blocks, the baby gnawing on my scarf. She laughed, the sound unguarded. "She likes you," she said simply. And though the words were obvious, they filled me like light through stained glass. That night, as I washed the scarf, I thought about the ways love shifts shape. Once, it had been sleepless nights and scraped knees, school forms and packed lunches. Now it was formula runs and babysitting, measured in small increments of trust. And outside their circle, it was rhyme time at the library, a new friend named Helen, a scarf I chose because it made me feel alive. For the first time in years, I began to understand, I didn't need to wait at the edges of someone else's life to prove I existed. I could build a life of my own, even as I loved them from where I stood. The two were not enemies. They were companions, finally learning how to share the same room inside me. The next Thursday at the library, I noticed how quickly the parents began to look for me. A father waved sheepishly when his daughter refused to let him put her down, and I took the child so he could stretch his arms. A mother asked if I could show her how to fold a sling without tangling it, and I guided her hands the way I once guided my son's when he was learning to tie his shoes. These were small gestures, unnoticed by most, but they settled into me like pebbles filling an empty jar. By the end of the session, I was tired but not lonely. There is a difference. Helen waved from the back of the room, she had come to watch her granddaughter. Afterward, we walked together, her bag of books thumping against her side, my scarf lifting in the wind. We talked about how grandchildren pull us into strange roles, how sometimes we feel invisible, and how sometimes invisibility is a kind of freedom. I realized, listening to her, that my ache was not mine alone. She carried her own stories of being left out, of hovering on the margins of her children's busy lives. We become the pause, she said, and they don't always notice that pauses are what give rhythm to the music. I thought about that all the way home. 2 days later, my son called again. Would you like to come by tomorrow? His voice was easier, less guarded. I said yes, and the next morning I baked a loaf of bread, nothing fancy, just the recipe my mother taught me, dense and fragrant with rosemary. When I arrived, the baby squealed at the sight of the bread bag. My daughter-in-law laughed, and for the first time, she leaned toward me instead of away. We spent the afternoon together. I fed the baby while she showered, the small trust of handing over her child without hesitation feeling like a gift greater than any words. My son came into the room, hair damp from fixing a leaky pipe in the bathroom, and for a moment it was like the old days, me with a baby in my arms, him wandering in with that same mix of pride and distraction. He looked at me, smiled in the old way, and said, "You've still got it, Mom." I carried those words home like a talisman. They were simple, even clumsy, but they meant I was seen. That evening, I called Helen, and we agreed to meet at the cafe on Tuesday. We talked about the book her club was reading, something I had skimmed just enough to join the conversation. The group welcomed me with polite nods, and by the end of the hour, one woman asked if I'd come again. I walked home in the dark with the strange, buoyant sense that I belonged in more than one place now. Of course, the silence crept back on certain days. There were still long stretches when the group chat held nothing but shared photos or reminders about the baby's sleep schedule. Sometimes I typed a message and deleted it before sending. Other times I sent it and received only an emoji in reply. But I had learned to fill those gaps differently. On Sundays, I went to the museum. On Thursdays, the library. On Tuesdays, the cafe. My calendar, once blank, began to look like a patchwork of quiet commitments. One evening, after a long day, I sat at my table with the red scarf folded beside me and realized something. I no longer waited for the phone to vibrate before living. If it rang, it rang. If it didn't, the day was not wasted. That realization, quiet as it was, felt like a door opening inside me. Not long after, my daughter-in-law called directly. Her voice was nervous. Would you stay with her for a night? Just one. We need rest. I agreed, of course, and the next evening they brought over a small bag with pajamas, bottles, and instructions written on a folded sheet. I smiled as I read it, all the rules I once tried to impose on my own mother, as if schedules could control the wildness of babies. I followed what I could, improvised what I had to, and when the baby finally fell asleep against my chest, I sat in the old rocking chair I had pulled from the attic and let the weight of her breathe against me. In the morning, when they returned, my son looked both rested and guilty. Was she terrible? He asked. No, I said softly. She was a baby. Babies are never terrible. My daughter-in-law pressed my hand, and though no more words passed between us, her eyes told me what her lips could not, "Thank you, and maybe I see you differently now." That afternoon, when the house was quiet again, I sat with my tea and realized something important. The hurt of that first dawn message, "Don't wake the baby with calls," still lived in me, but it no longer defined me. It was a moment, not a sentence. My role had shifted, yes, but I was not erased. I was becoming something else, a pause, as Helen had said. A pause that carried weight. I looked at the yellow carnation, wilted now, petals fraying, and decided not to replace it right away. Some things are meant to last only so long. Instead, I opened the window and let the cool air rush in. The house filled with sounds from the street, children on bicycles, the bark of a dog, the distant hum of traffic. Life, not mine alone, but life I was still a part of. And for the first time, I felt no urgency to prove it to anyone. The baby's first birthday arrived like a milestone none of us had prepared for. My son and his wife decorated their living room with balloons, a string of paper letters spelling out one, taped crookedly above the doorway. The house was full, friends from their neighborhood, her family, a few colleagues. The air smelled of sugar and pasta salad, the floor scattered with ribbons and crumbs. I stood near the wall with a cup of tea, watching, letting the noise wash over me. The baby sat in a high chair, a crown of cardboard perched unevenly on her fine hair. She pounded her hands into the cake with the glee of someone discovering both sweetness and chaos at once. Everyone laughed, phones held high to catch the moment. I didn't raise mine. I simply watched. I wanted to keep the sight in my own memory, unfiltered by glass. It might once have hurt me, standing slightly apart, not at the center of things. But now I felt something else, steadiness. To see my son's face glow with pride, to see his wife wipe the icing from their daughter's chin, to hear the room echo with joy, I realized I didn't need to be the flame anymore. It was enough to be a part of the circle of warmth. Later, after the cake was gone and the children tore through the house clutching balloons, my son came over, cheeks flushed. He touched my shoulder gently. "Thanks for coming, Mom." His words were plain, but in his eyes I saw recognition. Not the old dependency of a child, not the exasperation of recent months, but something steadier, the acknowledgement that I still belonged, even if my role had changed. When the guests left, I helped clear plates and gather the wreckage of napkins. My daughter-in-law bent at the same moment to pick up a balloon string, and our hands touched. She looked up at me, hesitant. "I know we've made mistakes," she said, her voice low so no one else could hear. "We're trying so hard, and sometimes I don't know how to balance it all." There was a crack in her tone that reminded me how very young she still was. Younger than I had been when I carried my son through his first year. I covered her hand with mine. "We all learn by stumbling. You're doing better than you think." Her eyes shone, and for a fleeting second, I saw her not as a gatekeeper between me and my granddaughter but as another woman, weary and hopeful, just like I once was. That was the bridge we had been missing. That night, back home, I hung the red scarf over the chair and sat with my tea. The house was still quiet, but it didn't feel punishing. I thought about how far I had come since that first dawn message, "Don't wake the baby with calls." The ache of it still lingered, but now it felt like a scar, a reminder of hurt survived, not a wound still open. The following weeks carried a gentler rhythm. Some days brought silence, some brought small invitations. On Tuesdays, I joined Helen at the book club, where we laughed over novels we half disliked and argued with a passion that surprised us both. On Thursdays, the library filled me with the babble of babies and the gratitude of exhausted parents. Sundays became my museum days. My calendar, once bare, now held its own kind of pattern, a life not dictated by waiting. One evening, my son called, his voice tired but easier than before. "Would you stay with her tomorrow? Just a few hours. We want to go out, just the two of us." I agreed, of course, though my heart ached at how long it had been since he'd last asked. The next day, they dropped her off with a bag of pajamas, bottles, and careful instructions. I smiled as I read them, all the rules I once wrote for my own mother, as if paper could protect a baby from the chaos of life. After they left, the house filled with sounds I hadn't heard in years, small cries, the slap of tiny hands against the floor, the endless rustle of a child exploring every corner. She napped briefly, then woke and refused the bottle, then giggled when I pretended to sneeze into her blanket. When evening came and she finally slept against my chest, I carried her into the old rocking chair I had pulled from the attic. The creak of its wooden joints, the rise and fall of her small body against mine, the hum of my own lullaby, all of it braided the years together. My son is a baby, my granddaughter now, me in both times at once. I sat there long after she drifted into heavy sleep, unwilling to let the moment slip. When they returned, their faces glowed from a rare night out. My son kissed his daughter's head, then looked at me. "Was she terrible?" he asked with a grin that was half nervous. "No," I said softly. "She was herself. Babies are never terrible." My daughter-in-law pressed my hand, her eyes meeting mine in a quiet gratitude that words couldn't hold. After they left, I sat alone again, but not lonely. The rocking chair still swayed a little under me, carrying the echo of her weight. It struck me then, the shape of my love had changed, but it hadn't diminished. I was no longer the central pillar of my son's life, but I was still a beam that held some corner of the structure. A few days later, walking by the river with Helen, she looked at me and said, "You seem lighter these days." I smiled, because she was right. I had stopped holding my breath for invitations. I had stopped waiting for the phone to prove I mattered. My life was not just an echo anymore, it was a voice again. One Sunday, at the museum, I found myself standing once more before the painting of the winter landscape, white layered over green. A man near my age stood beside me again, the same one I'd seen weeks earlier. He tilted his head and murmured, "Still see the green?" I smiled. More of it, this time. He chuckled, and we stood together in silence, seeing what others walked past without noticing. That night, my son sent a photo in the group chat, the baby asleep on his chest, her tiny hand gripping his shirt. Underneath, he wrote, "She's my whole world." My heart swelled and broke at once. I typed back, "I know. And she's lucky to have you." A pause followed, then his reply, "We're lucky to have you too, Mom." I set the phone down, tears blurring my sight. The words were not elaborate, not dramatic. But they were enough. The days continued to stretch and fold. Some mornings were lonely, others full. I learned to sit with both. I began planting small herbs on the windowsill, basil, rosemary, thyme, not because I needed them, but because they grew under my care. Watching new green leaves push through soil reminded me that growth often happens quietly, without permission, without audience. On the anniversary of my husband's death, I visited the cemetery with a single yellow carnation. I told him about our granddaughter, about the way she laughed when I sneezed, about the way our son was learning to be a father. I told him I was learning too, not how to raise, but how to step back, how to be present without pressing. The wind moved through the trees, and I felt, for a moment, that he heard me. Weeks later, as spring tilted into summer, my son and his wife invited me to the park for a picnic. We sat on the grass while the baby crawled after dandelions. My daughter-in-law leaned back on her elbows, her laughter easy, and I realized she had begun to trust me not as a rival but as an ally. My son lay on the blanket, tossing crumbs to sparrows, and for the first time in a long while, I felt not like an outsider, but like part of their small circle. Not the core, but not the edge either. Somewhere steady in between. That evening, back at my house, I placed the empty picnic basket on the counter and thought about what love becomes when it stretches across time. It becomes less about possession, more about witness. Less about instruction, more about presence. Less about being the one who holds the baby all night, more about being the one who stands at the doorway, steady, waiting, ready. As dusk fell, I wrapped the red scarf around my shoulders and stepped outside. The air smelled of cut grass and wood smoke. I walked slowly down the street, each step measured, not toward anyone, not waiting for a call, but simply because the evening was mine. At the corner, I stopped and looked back at my house, small, quiet, steady. Inside, the chair still rocked slightly from where I had sat the night before. The herbs on the windowsill leaned toward the light. And the yellow carnation, though wilted now, still held its shape. I smiled to myself, turned back to the road, and walked on. I am still here. And that, I thought, is enough.